Wow, that was the weakest hi ever. Hi!
Hi.
Thanks. My name is Christina Ruiz-Mesa. I'm from the Center for Multicultural Affairs here at Villanova.
My name is Krista Malad, and I am in the Department of Education. I train mental health counselors and undergraduate human service students.
And we're talking today about microaggressions, micro-insults, and a lot of words that start with micro. So how many of you have heard, you read the description and you had heard some of these words before and knew what they were?
Yeah. Where did you, can I just kind of get a poll, where did you hear about those words?
Intro to human services class.
Intro to human services. It wasn't me, was it? Nice, okay. Okay.
Then we had another hand.
I heard about it in an article I read.
Where?
In an article I read about diversity and discrimination.
Okay. Okay, an article.
Psychology class.
Psychology, okay. So, readings, class. Okay. I'm going to let Christina talk a little bit about what it is. This is something that she actually did her thesis on here at Villanova University. So I consider her sort of the expert, especially the local expert on that and what's going on here. So I'm going to have her start and talk about it.
So microaggressions are kind of what they sound like. They are small, subtle jabs, jests said to people, primarily people of color, and made to kind of feel a little off and make people feel inferior or like they don't belong. Now, microaggressions can be as kind of innocent as people saying, oh, lights turned off, and this is an actual example from Villanova a few years ago. A professor was showing a movie, turned off the lights, and said, oh, where did so-and-so go? Oh, exactly. And I see a few eyes going, oh my goodness. So the professor thought they were making a joke, when in actuality, very hurtful and very kind of pointed statement to someone. Another example happened a long time before you were all at Villanova, when a class was getting into a discussion of race. An article was being read about race, and the professor said to a young African-American woman, you know, you don't have to come to class next week. It's going to be a little uncomfortable for you. Yeah. So these are more deliberate examples and less micro. So if, for example, the professor had said, you know what, next week, you've got stuff to do, you don't have to come to class, and kind of in a passing manner, somewhat micro. So before I give too many examples and give away our exercising a little bit, microaggressions, what to keep in mind, they are subtle. They are not always explicitly said about race, but can be interpreted by a person as being racially motivated. So for example, if someone says something to me, are they saying it to me because I'm Christina, because I'm me, or are they saying it because I happen to be a Latina? And am I associating that with my racial identity, my ethnic identity, rather than my actual person? So it's these subtle little things that can be interpreted, and over time, these subtle microaggressions, they add up. And they can make people feel like, you know what, maybe I'm not supposed to be here. Maybe I am not a part of this. And over time, they affect people, and people have different strategies for coping with microaggressions. Some of them can be acting out. Some of them can be getting very negative, getting very defensive. So over time, that's an important thing to remember, is that these subtle little things that can seem very innocent in passing have a very, very intense effect on people.
And I will add that many microaggressions they're usually statements, but they can be actions, are usually implemented by people, white people that might usually look like me, and people have very nice intentions, they have very good hearts, and so I myself have been the perpetrator of probably many microaggressions in my lifetime. So it doesn't make me a bad person, but because I wasn't aware of those things, the subtlety of those things, I was inadvertently, unconsciously hurting others. And so today is about kind of becoming aware of how might we be inadvertently or unconsciously offending or hurting others, and what are those statements. And so as you see some of those statements that people make that are microaggressions, or perhaps they're not, we're going to have a little bit of debate about some of those, you may have a reaction like, oh, I've said that before, oh, I'm a terrible person, oh, kind of try to withhold that reaction and just go with it, and we can discuss afterwards. Okay, so I'll describe what we're going to do. We're going to pair up. We'll pair you up into groups, and then what we're going to do is do a debate. We're going to give you a bunch of statements, and then we'll let you decide about them. And so we've got several different forms of microaggressions, and I'm just going to very briefly read you off the definitions. I'll give you a sheet so that it can remind you, and then they're also up on the wall. And then you get to decide, oh, this statement here, is that a microinvalidation or is that a micro-insult? For instance, and then if it is a micro-invalidation, your group decides, as a group, and you set it down here, or you might say, well, I don't really think that's a racist insult. I'm going to put that under not a form of racism. So we've got this, that, and that, 4 different stations for you to choose. So 3 forms of microaggression. We have micro-assault. That's a little easier. Assault kind of sounds more outward, kind of like it sounds. It's very explicit. People, when they are implementing or perpetrating a micro-assault, that's usually they're aware of it. They're doing it because they say, I'm a racist, I think I'm superior because I'm white, let's say, and I mean to hurt somebody by saying this thing or doing this thing. So it's not just a physical assault. It could be a verbal assault. It could be writing something on someone's door that is racially motivated. It could be deliberately avoiding somebody or doing something discriminatory like voting for a law that would be discriminatory toward people of color, for instance. Then there's a micro-insult. This is more subtle than an assault. Micro-insults are usually communications, but they can be actions also, that sound kind of rude to the person that hears it. Could be an insensitive comment. It can demean a person's racial heritage or identity. It's subtle, usually unknown to the person that's saying it or doing it. That person would say, but I didn't mean to insult you. And it can be, again, verbal or nonverbal. And there are going to be several examples of those things on the walls too. So if you're not really sure where your comment fits in, you could read the examples to get an idea. And then there's a micro-invalidation. So invalidation is a communication that can exclude or negate or nullify the thoughts, feelings, or the reality of a person of color. Again, this is often subtle, and the person that perpetrates it doesn't really feel that they're doing anything that's insulting. They don't really mean to insult. And it can be verbal or nonverbal. And we'll have, again, examples along the walls. So before we get started, any questions? Okay, so we're going to have you, as a group, decide where that's... I think that's okay. So make sure you place all your cards where they belong.
We had a hard time with one.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Where we thought.
go put it where you...
Well, we are in disagreement, so that's why.
Well, can you do majority votes? What was majority?
Should we do that? I guess so. We'll do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like some groups had some big debates, and others you guys were quick.
It's true. So if you look at the piles, you can see all kinds of different colors. And the colors were representative of a question. So each question was the same color for every group. So it's easy at first glance to tell that we have some very different opinions
In the room, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, overall, how'd your group go? How was it?
It was pretty hard. It was hard to tell the difference between micro-insult and micro-invalidation.
Invalidation? Okay, so somewhat similar, but you felt like it was pretty easy to narrow it down to those two at least?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, is that true for other groups, or did you have a different experience?
I would say that it was, yeah, I agree with her because both are very subtle, so it's like, sometimes it's very difficult to say this and this because for that situation.
Yeah, we talked a lot about how we think it would really depend on how the comment was delivered, and it would may or may not change our decision if we had heard the tone of voice, the way someone said it.
Okay, can you give an example of something that might depend on tone of voice?
I mean, there's just a couple that if they had been said in a very positive manner, they may have fallen into one category, but if they had been said in a snobby, kind of I'm better than you way, it would have been more extreme. I guess, if that makes sense.
So you mean if it was said in a positive manner, it would fall under which category?
It would be probably invalidation rather than insult, or insult rather than assault.
Okay. Almost sounds like you're saying that if it's more sort of, I know I'm superior to you, almost like a conscientious thing, that it would be a micro-assault versus you're saying it unknowingly.
And saying it meaning to be positive, but just not realizing. You know what I mean? It's hard to judge from the
Got it.
from the kind.
Got it. Okay.
And aside from tone, what other factors do you think play a role into how individual questions are interpreted? What else?
I think it depends if you're like really good friends with the person or if it's someone you just met. 'Cause I think if
So the
you see-
relationship?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you agree with that?
I'm so concrete, I need an example. So give me an example of one that, like, if I was a friend, I wouldn't consider that, I don't know.
Like things you would never say to a stranger, you might be more comfortable saying to someone closer with.
So you're saying if someone was my friend that I wouldn't take it as a racial slight, but if it was a stranger, then I would take it as a racial slight?
I guess.
Okay.
I think my best friend at home is black, and I live in a largely white town, so I know that she's struggled. As we became closer friends, we started to have more direct discussions about racism, and I'm sure that I've done micro insults and micro invalidations to her, but I know she's done the same thing to me, thinking that, well, once we became more comfortable with each other, we kind of like opened up about like what we thought, but it also allowed prejudice to happen.
That you're more open, more honest about prejudices that you've learned?
Right. Right. And then because of that, like, we were often deeply hurt by each other, and we struggled to address them. Like, I struggled to be able to tell her, you know, what you just said right there, that hurt me.
Oh, okay. So what I'm hearing is that even though you're good friends, that you still can hear the racial kind of stereotype or insult.
And like, we wouldn't realize we were doing it to each other, because like, I really, like, she's a very important person to me, and I would say things and not realize that had hurt her until she addressed me about it, like, blowing up later.
Yeah.
I was upset by that.
And that's the whole thing about micro assaults, is that most people don't even realize they're saying those things. Why do you think most people don't realize that they're sort of insulting somebody racially?
I have a question. To what extent do you think microaggressions take into account the perpetrator's intention? Like,
Well, initially, if it's the first time you've ever heard something, initially you may question, especially as we're depending where you are in your racial development. The first time you hear something, you might be like, huh. So if someone makes a comment about my dancing skills, the first time I'd be like, no, maybe I'm not a good dancer. The second time you hear it, you're saying, well, are they saying this because I'm Latin and Latin women are supposed to be able to dance? So the more you hear things, the higher the tendency is that you will attribute them to racial insults rather than personal. But the first time you hear something, it's like when you get into, someone says something really rude to you and you walk away and you're like, 5 minutes later, you're like, I can't believe they just said that. But it kind of takes that processing time. It's the same thing when you're hearing these things. The first time you hear something, you're not going to be like, oh. Most people, if it's that subtle, you're going to have to take a moment to kind of process and be like, wait a minute, why was that said to me? Does that make sense?
because my question is, like, especially with 2 and 3, it seems to imply that, like, these kind of microaggressions are like a result of like the perpetrator's unawareness of what's being said. But then, like, at the same time, like, you can take something like a racist joke, and obviously, I guess in certain circumstances, like, there can be an understanding that somebody is saying a racist joke without like any intention of being derisive or whatever. But at the same time, like, the person is aware that they are making a comment that could be perceived as racist. So, like, would that be considered a micro-invalidation or like a micro-assault? I don't know if that was clear, but like I could tell a racist joke, and like I am cognizant of the fact that it could be interpreted like derisively, but I know that my intention isn't that it should be.
It's not your intention, it's how the person receives it.
Receives it.
So as the person, as the source of the comment, you're not saying, you wouldn't have oftentimes kind of the way, because it's individual. It's how the person who is receiving the message and hearing the message would classify that depending on their own attribution theory for any communication majors here. It's how you as a person are attributing the statement that's being said to you and how you interpret it based on your own experiences, not only with your own identity, but the climate in which you're living. Does that make sense? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, kind of the combination between climate and microaggressions and one's individual culture.
Just going back to the relationship aspect of it for a second, I kind of feel like it doesn't really matter what your relationship is, because that, I think it's like what you just said, it's how they receive it. And maybe if you're closer with a person or they're your really good friend, they'll be able to tell what you're sort of, maybe they'll know what you're, whether or not it was intentional or not, but it doesn't change the fact that you still made it. And so I think their inclination to let it go or forgive it might be increased with a friendship, but it doesn't change the fact that you still made it.
And the example I usually use for this is if I step on your toe, I didn't mean to step on your toe. My intention was not to hurt you. Does it hurt any less because I didn't mean to do it?
Exactly.
And it's how you deal with it. Again, are you like, oh, it's fine, and walk away? Or you're like, I can't believe you just stepped on my toe. Again, it's that attribution. If someone intentionally stepped on your toe, how are you going to react to it? Or did you not realize it was intentional right at first? And it's a similar, it's a way that it makes more sense to understand. You know, if someone steps on your toe, they didn't mean it, maybe they did, does it hurt any less? And that's kind of the example that I like to use for that.
Example.
Well, even though it doesn't hurt any less, isn't it basically like you would react in a completely different way? Like, I mean, I don't really see how, I feel like that's just a huge form of miscommunication, like on the receiving end, if you are like offended by things that people are not trying to offend you with. Like, do you know what I'm saying?
So I'm trying to figure out, kind of do a summary of what you're saying. Can you kind of say a little bit more about it?
So basically you're saying that like even if someone says something that they are not intending to have any sort of negative meaning, if you interpret it as having negative meaning, then like aren't you misinterpreting them? Like
well, let's go back to the statements themselves. We had the category of not racist versus racist. So what you guys decided is that, yes, some of these statements in and of themselves are racist, right? And some of them may not be. And so the statement itself, whether or not I mean to say something racist, but if I say something racist and it's received by that person and they perceive it as racist also, then they're reacting to the fact that it was racist. It doesn't matter whether or not I meant to do that. It still is what it is. Does that make sense? And so I could say, hey, I didn't mean to do that, so, don't feel bad about it, but it's still a racist statement. I don't know if I'm explaining it very well.
It's much like if I say no disrespect, but that outfit's hideous. Because I said no disrespect, it still could be very offensive. And it's kind of a similar thing, even if the source did not mean it for it to be racist, like Dr. Ball said, if it's interpreted as such, if it is because of my own experiences, that's how we see everything. We don't all come with like a set of guidelines. Like when you hear the word love, you will think red heart with a little line in the middle. When you hear the word dog, you're going to think Lassie. We don't all come with kind of programmed things about how we see language, how we hear words. It is our life experiences that give us that paradigm, that give us that lens through which we can see the world. So I might not intend for something to be racist because in my own experiences, in my way of seeing the world, it's not. But I don't know how you see the world, and I don't know how your experiences are going to hear my words. It's kind of like a red ribbon. If I show you a red ribbon, what significance does a red ribbon have in of itself? Nothing. It's a red ribbon. But it's what that red ribbon symbolizes. It might symbolize AIDS, it might symbolize heart disease, it might symbolize different things for you because of your experiences and your own life that you bring into it.
Yeah. It might become a little more clear as we actually get some examples. Let's take a look at a couple of actual ones that you guys struggled with. We'll sort of apply it to what she's asking. Any ones that you had, I know some of you were debating, so any of the ones that you were debating on that you want to bring up that were just very confusing?
Yeah, our group. We ended up with one at the end that we had a hard time classifying, and we sort of went back and forth whether it was racist at all or if it was possibly an insult or something else. And it was the one that said something about someone being beautiful because they're exotic.
Okay. Where'd you end up putting that?
I think we ended up putting it as not a racist comment,
But we were still split.
yeah, I think I ended up being the last dissenter.
Okay.
But I kind of felt that it was an insult because to me there was just something wrong about telling someone that they're beautiful because they're exotic. I thought that somehow that creates a distinction between this is what's normal and you're not normal, so that's what makes you beautiful. That I kind of saw there, so we sort of struggle with that.
Okay. So I find Black and Asian women beautiful because they're exotic. So two groups of color, and saying they're all so beautiful because they're all so exotic is kind of the statement. So your reasoning was that this is racist, and it sort of, because it focuses on this group. What was the counter argument to that one?
I was part of the people in the counter argument, and I understood what she said. I did agree that it could seem like an attempt at a compliment, which is what she said, and I agreed with that. But I also heard that like 2 weeks ago here at Villanova, and I took it as a compliment because I know I look different than a lot of people that are here. So for someone to notice that was white and say that, like I was like, thank you, you know, like you think I'm beautiful because I am different. And I liked it personally, but I can see how someone would not appreciate that at the same time.
Okay, so being in the context of Villanova, you took it as like, because I'm different, I'm obviously different from a lot of the people here, so that's a compliment for me.
But it's not a bad thing. Well,
Okay.
to some people, like they don't see it as a bad thing.
Okay.
I guess,
So other experiences with this one? What you guys had?
Well, I just thought that it was like sort of racist because, I mean, you could just stop at, like, I think Black and Asian women are beautiful. You just stop there, but to me, like, exotic means like you're foreign, but it's like not all Asian women and not all Black women were not born like in the United States, like in, I guess, in the context of Villanova, like not all of them were born overseas. Like I personally was born here, so I would find it insulting because it's like, okay, so you think I'm foreign.
Okay, so you associated the word exotic with foreign, or other than you're not American, basically.
Right.
Okay, and you're right. No, that's an assumption. You know, many of us are American. And I think that some of the research does show, they've had some research that took a look at who's considered most American. And when you think of someone who's American, it tends to be someone that looks like me. And actually Asian Americans are considered the least American. And it goes down from there to Latino, to African American, to whites. But yeah, so there is sort of that connotation that you don't belong here, you're the other.
My biracial sons, when they were very young, and they had, both of them had blue eyes and blonde hair and dark skin, well, darker than a white child, but lighter than an African American child, were often called exotic. And I think what it was people didn't know how to, I think they're gorgeous, but to me, it was that being a biracial kid, and this is again 25 years ago, it was hard to classify, and so they didn't know what to call them.
And how was it, I mean, as your kids got older, how was it received by them? Did they like that, or did they find it offensive, or did they get upset, or?
I have one son who is radically biracial and one son who is radically Black.
And by radically you mean?
My son Jesse refers to biracial children, or biracial peers across the board as his people. And he talks about the fact that when Barack Obama was elected, that, you know, it wasn't just, he said it wasn't the Black person, it was elected, it was his people. And because he says that the experience of biracial kids in this culture, and unfortunately he was educated in mainline schools, in a mainline school, that their experiences were different than either of the racial groups. And my radically Black son, God has such a great sense of humor. His skin lightened incredibly as he grew older, and his hair got kinkier, so now he's got like waist-length dreads. And he sort of like says he's going to end the argument. So he does, and it was the ambiguity of the way other people see it.
And it sounded like because of that ambiguity, they didn't fit into the American norm of what people, you know, again, they were looked at as other and outside of.
Right.
And so that's part of the statement, which some people have mentioned, that sense of like, oh, you don't look like us per se, that we don't look like the white dominant group.
Because it's because there is a norm.
Normative, yep, of like, you know, kind of whiteness. So, Leah.
Yeah, for me, the expression was considered an assault because exotic for me means strange, something that I haven't seen frequently. So when I realized something is different, and I believe Black or Asian, Latino, American women has their own characteristics, and that made them beautiful. But not because I am beautiful, because according to Americans, because I look different. I think that's my point, that I
Look different from the standard white normative.
From the normal for them. So for that reason, I consider it insult.
Okay, did you mean to use the word assault a minute ago? Would you go as far as saying it's an assault, or is it just an insult?
Oh, yeah, we say assault.
Assault. Okay. And that idea of exoticizing or making someone the other, is sort of historically in the United States something that very much was done with women of color, especially with slavery, and it's sort of a way, and especially when you talk about current day, modern day slavery, particularly with Asian women in Asia, it's exoticizing them to make them sort of dehumanize them so that they can be seen or used as sexual objects. And so there's a very historical kind of underpinning to that statement, which when people understand that people realize, I don't think that's such a nice idea behind that.
Yeah, and as well, the word exotic for me just calls to mind the way that we use it today. I mean, if you're going to hear that a woman is an exotic dancer, that's saying that she's hypersexualized, and I think it really draws on the idea that there's something about a woman that isn't like me, and that isn't a white woman, that is different, and that's less of a subject, more of an object, and more sexual and meant to be looked at.
Yeah, and you can look today in the media and you can see how women of color are hypersexualized. You can see pictures of them dressed up as animals when they're selling cars and they're selling, perfume, and you can see that just interspersed throughout our media. But the idea behind this is that a lot of times we say these statements and we don't mean them. And so I might say this and totally not mean it in an insulting way. But there is a history behind this that is tied up in slavery, that's tied up in sort of oppression and putting people into an other category and used, for racial violence, sexual violence, etc. When you look into the history of some of these statements, then all of a sudden it's like, I kind of understand why someone might interpret it that way. It might be harmful to them. And so there's that idea that with many of these statements here that they have a context of whiteness connected to them, and that's why even if I don't mean this, I'm taking my whiteness with me and I'm pushing it onto someone else, and I'm taking the history and pushing it onto someone else, and people are hearing that even if I don't know it. Because I learned this without even knowing it because it's part of the culture. And so that's why when you ask, though, if I didn't mean it, then they shouldn't be insulted. It's like they're not necessarily insulted by you per se, but what's being kind of put at them and the history of that and the real true implications behind that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have a question. So what word could you say to not insult anyone to convey the same meaning?
Well, it depends.
Like to convey the meaning of...
For that message?
Yeah, like to convey the meaning of, I think that Asian and black women are beautiful because they are different than white people. Like because they have specific characteristics as Asian women and as black women that I find to be different than the women that are of my own race. And I think that those specific characteristics are more beautiful.
What characteristics would you describe for your race?
For my race?
Yeah. Describe all people of your race.
I mean...
It's difficult. So, am I right?
But so there can't be a conception of I am attracted to Asian and black women. Like you can't say that.
Ugly Betty, Jennifer Lopez. Both Latin women, but very different in their features, very different in their body types, very different in how they are portrayed in the media. And I was teasing Krista the other day. I said, Ugly Betty shook my world. She messed with me because I had Shakira, I had Jennifer Lopez. I'm like, we're doing all right, Latin women, Then Ugly Betty gets on prime time, the first prime time show basically targeting Latinos. And they have this woman on there who is supposed to be this Latin executive, and she's, she's doing all this great stuff, she's educated, but then what did they take from her? She's not seen as traditionally beautiful as a Latin woman. They have her dressing kind of frumpy clothes, and she mix match, and her hair's a mess. So, yes, she's got all kinds of characteristics that traditionally, and the Betty la Fea, which is where the original came from, the idea was, it was kind of a play on how Latin women are portrayed in the media, because super hypersexualized, and when you think of Latin women, the first color that comes to your mind, red. You think of red, and you think of satin and velvet, all this stuff. The same thing with black women. Is Oprah the same as Beyonce? We think Asian women, are we thinking Lucy Liu? Who are we thinking when we say these kind of categories? Because it's very difficult. Latin America, 21 countries, and 21 very different countries. Africa, you've got an entire continent that we're talking about. Asia, we've got an entire continent, very different features. So it's very difficult to say all American women are beautiful, all Hispanic women are beautiful. I wouldn't go as far to say any giant category. I might say that you are beautiful as individuals, but making those big categories is kind of a little troublesome.
am I interpreting it, it's troublesome because it's tapping into, when you're trying to like put a whole group into one category is when it
Yes.
becomes sort of problematic?
In a positive or negative way. And it's the same that we say, oh, Asians are so smart. Well, what does that mean? And how are we kind of, how are we establishing what we mean as smart? How are we establishing which group, and it might be something, again, that was supposed to be positive. Well, Asians study hard and they do well in school and, you know, they're smart. Well, when you do statements like that, think about the pressure that puts on people. Because as an Asian person, I'm supposed to be smart. What kind of pressure does that, as a Latin woman, I'm supposed to be beautiful. Does that mean I can't go out without makeup or heels? What does that mean, and what kind of pressure does that put on me as an individual because of this grouping? So that's what I would say, it's problematic.
Okay, okay. Do you want to take another one just to kind of continue
Yeah.
on with the confusion? Because again, we had a couple of debates.
And thank you for your feedback. This is how conversations, this is super important, guys. We might not all agree on things, but the fact that we're having this conversation is huge, huge. So thank you.
Other statements that stood out to you or were confusing?
You guys remember what they are? No? Okay.
Yep.
Oh, you got it.
We disagreed, well, I think partially, we put it in one category, but on the doctor statement, whether that was
Which statement was that?
The doctor is...
where he asked the
there's
black
a black
man
patient.
how he's been affected, his health has been affected by racism.
Ah.
Okay.
Whenever my dad, who's a doctor, is a black patient, he asked them how racism has affected their health. That one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what did you decide?
I would have put it in the not a form of racism. I think as a group, as a whole, we did a micro-validation. And I guess it's something I struggled with because I didn't think the doctor, like, whether he had intention or not, like we said, that doesn't really matter. But you wouldn't necessarily, in general, ask a white person how racism has really affected their lives in general, because you wouldn't think that, like, they would have the same effects of racism that someone of color or any other origin, ethnicity would have. So, like, I was, even though it says black specifically, I was, like, putting in all different types of forms, like Indian, Asian, like, and
For
even
people
though
of
it
color
says
then.
that, I just figured that if you asked a person, like, who is different, that wouldn't be racist.
Okay. And the other side of the story,
Oh, no. If somebody else had to say it. I just wanted to like put a little input on it. I think we were kind of going for it was racist because you wouldn't ask a white person if racism has affected their health, right? But I think I don't know if maybe I'm getting too far into the question, but I think there is a point where racism also affects white people. And me and my roommate were talking about this, and we were talking about basically like I can get scholarships because I'm black. He can't. There's barely any scholarships out there that you're just fine just because you're white. And inherently, I didn't make myself black. I was born black. And he was born white. But because of that, he can't get my scholarship. So it's a form of racism excluding him from a scholarship.
so we're almost to that affirmative action question, which we'll definitely get to because it's
yeah.
we'll touch on that.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I think that just the fact that it probably does affect white people in some way, but the question can be answered, but probably the awkwardness is just like, why would you ask me that? So I don't think it's racist at all.
Oh, so you don't see it as racism? Okay, so we've got a vote. Well, it sounds like you're kind of saying the same thing then. Neither one of you see it as racist. then.
No, my thing is, like, I understand that there are white people that experience racism, like, in terms of, like, they could be poor and, like, that wouldn't be racism, but, like,
Classism.
yeah. So, like, in that version or reverse discrimination with, like, affirmative action, but I think, like, history shows the degree of, like, racism obviously being higher for people
Of color.
Yeah, of color.
Okay, so your sense was it's not a racist question because reality is that it really does affect people of color more than white people, although it does affect white people too. Racism affects white people, and for many reasons. For many reasons, it does. We could go all into that discussion. But I'll explain that one because I actually made that up. I would put that under not a form of racism, and actually just the idea of asking somebody, treating somebody of color differently than somebody who's white, sometimes is an okay thing. In this instance, the doctor's acknowledging that you have a different, you walk in the world and experience things differently than someone who has lighter skin. And it affects you differently. And research is now showing, there are so many studies coming out that racism can physically affect somebody's health. That racism really has negative effects for people of color, and it physically, emotionally, mentally, all that stuff. And so what they've actually done is, and especially for black males and blood pressure, there have been a lot of studies connecting those. And so there's a recent study that came out that talked about, they had some doctors that said, every time I see a particular black male patient, I'm going to ask them, you're coming in to see me about this, and how is this connected to racism at all, and do you think it is? And then they measured the men's blood pressure after the study, after getting the question from the doctor, and their blood pressure significantly lowered after having that question. And they think part of the reason was because somebody finally just recognized, just asked them and just said, I know this is your reality. I know you experience this because you're of color, and it happens more to people of color, and I know this could affect your health, does it? And so part of it was just having somebody ask that was so meaningful to these men and really affected their health. And so I wanted to get across the idea that it's okay sometimes, actually a lot of times, to talk about race issues and to notice the differences racially, because people of color have to walk through the world differently. They experience things much more differently, and for me to ignore that and be colorblind and be like, oh, I'm not going to bring up race, I'm not going to bring up anything, because I'm a therapist, so if I see a client of color, I'm probably going to bring up, is this at all related to being black, per se, if they bring in a problem with me and it seems like it may be connected, etc. And so that's respectful. And so that idea that, oh, it's taboo to talk about race all the time, we can't bring it up. No, that there are times when we can really bring up stuff and talk to people and talk about our differences. So there is a time. It's not always racist.
I have a question about, I'm necessarily asking a white person if they're afflicted by racism. Well, I look white, but I'm actually Mexican, so like, how can you approach that? Like, asking me if I'm affected by racism because I hear it all the time, so how do you approach that? You
probably hear it all the time too because you look white, and so people assume you're white, and so they make racist comments around you?
Yeah.
Just assuming?
Yeah.
Okay, so
how does the doctor approach asking, are you affected by racism? But he thinks I'm white, so...
How do you think the doctor should approach that?
I don't know. Asking everyone.
Would it be meaningful for you if the doctor asked you, do you think?
No, I'm just saying, like, because it was mentioned earlier that it would be okay not to ask a white person about everybody else, but what about the people that look like a certain way? So it's just like basing,
assuming
on by how a person looks.
So, do you want to respond to that?
If you go back, I think like the way you were saying with the example is they asked the question with the intention, or if the doctor knew the intention was to make you feel more comfortable, like with them and have your blood pressure like lower, because like he's recognized it, okay, and now I can like go through it. So if they were to ask you that question and you would feel more comfortable about it, then I think then you should be asked the question, because that's what the intention of the question is, to get you to be more comfortable and get you more laid back. If they ask you a question and they get you more amped up and like aggressive and blood pressure starts rising, then the doctor should not have asked the question.
Yeah. I'm gonna go right here, and I'm gonna say this is. Were you gonna respond to this as well before I jump in?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I don't know if this is too far off base, but like coming like as a in a medical profession, I would think that like because different races have different effects to like certain ways of treatment and like how their bodies react to different things, I would think like off the bat the doctor would generally know what race you were based on like forms you fill out. So that might be something to think about, even though it's kind of getting technical, away from the race question, but just like acknowledging that generally the mistake shouldn't be made if they did.
So you're saying they should have it on a form that they can fill out. And I suppose that if you walked, what's your name? Esteban. If you walked in and I saw on your form you put Mexican American, first generation, then I'll know to kind of inquire about that. And is this somehow connected? I mean, that could be. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, because I know like when I go, like they always have them fill out like
medical history and all that.
Yeah, and
I think
background.
I think you make a good point. So those of you who are interested in going into medicine, being aware that people that look like us, you might have a few clues. I have that last name, that Ruiz, really gives me away. But let me know. My husband thought he was getting a nice Italian girl. I said, get a nice Puerto Cuban. But So if the name's not there, if I take my married name, Christina Johns, sounds real Latin, right? So if I don't have a name that kind of can trigger something, again, looking at that history, and those of you who are going into medicine, kind of encouraging your patients to find out more about their history is super important. Yes,
Yeah, my last name's Johnson.
Oh, so you were right there with me, see? Exactly. So but your first name might kind of trigger someone, maybe, but did you go by Steve?
Yeah, well, like recently people found out I was Mexican, but they thought I was just white. Just my name, just.
And as a patient, I think it's really important that you know, as a patient, that you know what, people might not know what I am. So if there are certain things that can affect people of my race or my ethnicity, it's important that you bring that forward. And it's kind of that new campaign that's going on right now. Make sure you're asking questions. Make sure you're telling your doctor. So if you are, it's Italians, for example. Italians, people of Mediterranean anemia is very focused in a certain area. If your ancestors are from a certain area, it's important that you tell a doctor so that when you're having kids, you can say, hey, just so you know, this is my history, this is my heritage. Can you make sure you add that test in or something? So that's important that you are open and honest with that and with your medical field as well. Go ahead.
I understand, I guess, the benefit of a doctor asking that question, but I just wonder where would the questioning stop? I mean, I'm white, but I'm a woman. I've experienced sexism. That's definitely affected how I feel and how I operate in the world, and definitely my blood pressure sometimes. And I mean, where do the questions stop? Shouldn't there be questions about like your socioeconomic background and how that's affected you, or how your education, or?
There's a lot of research that connects health issues with living in poverty for many, many reasons. A lot of it is related to the stress of poverty. There's a lot of research now that's coming out of connecting racism to health issues. I haven't seen any research related to women and how sexism affects women. We need a researcher, so could be a future calling. So there is that idea that, and so those of you who are going to be trained as mental health workers, who are going to be health workers, you are more and more going to be trained to understand how do your different ethnicity, your gender identity, all those aspects affect your health, affect your patients' and clients' health, so that we now can start helping clients address those issues, working with them in some way. It's instead of tailoring everything by one treatment for all. Yeah.
And that goes back to, I'm going to call Dr. Nance out, which she's always, what is fair and equal? And they are not the same thing. Because if you treat everyone the same, there are different qualifications. The example that I always remember is, everyone gets the same bed when you live on campus, right? Well, all 5'2" of me is not going to fill the bed. But if there is someone who is 6'5", they get the same size bed. Well, that's fair, right? Everybody gets the same bed. Not fair, because you can't fit comfortably into it. So you got to always think about that. What's fair, what's equal. So everyone fitting comfortably in a bed, that is equal. Making sure that those adjustments are made, even if my bed might be 6 foot and yours might be 7. So kind of making that distinction between fair and equal.
What about any other ones that stood out to you? I want to make sure that we answer all your questions about the statements.
Can I present one of my personal experiences?
Okay.
Because I was having a discussion with my friend. This recently happened over the weekend. We were taking the subway because we were going to Philly. We had a group of like 16 people, and we were all white. And we walked down to the subway, and everyone else there was black. And as we were walking down, waiting for our train, we heard a guy who was in another group say, "Oh, here comes the Milky Way." And like loud enough for us to hear. And I kind of took offense to that, but like some of my friends just laughed it off and like whatever. So we kind of got into a discussion on that, but I was just wondering like how other people would perceive that, like, because I almost took it as a form of like a micro assault, because he said it loudly enough for us to hear, and then they all kind of like moved away from us. Like we weren't being obnoxious, we weren't loud, we were just kind of milling around waiting for our training. So I just wanted to know, like, to open it to the floor, how other people would perceive that.
I mean, I would feel the same way, like, as taking it as an assault. Like, I walked to the Philly Zoo from Penn and walked by a black woman, and she just, like, automatically made this comment about how it's, like, a mean white girl. Just, like, right to me on the street. So, like, it's just unnecessary. Like, she has no idea who I am. They have no idea that, like, maybe you're coming to Philly to go to like an African American convention. Like, who knows? They don't know you, and then they just like make a comment so loud that other people can hear. So I would have the same reaction.
Sure, that it felt like a racist comment. It felt offensive. Yeah. What if they said, "But I didn't mean it that way. I didn't have an intention of offending you." would that be okay then?
But then how did you mean it? Why did you, what was the meaning behind saying that? Was that just like acknowledge that we're different from you and you're okay with that? Like why else would you say, what else could be the meaning behind something like that?
I don't know, there's that question about intention that we have when we look at all of this. I mean, does it matter? Does attention matter? Or is it just, no, they said it, to me it's offensive?
I think the attention is definitely one of the most important parts.
Okay.
I mean, just that, like, if he had said it and, like, just, like, kind of, like, to a friend,
Mhm.
that would have been okay, but he, like, directed it at us,
At
and
you.
then they all moved away from us.
So it felt like it was like really meant for you to hear.
Yeah.
So it felt offensive. And I won't speak for you, but one of the reasons why today I wanted to focus on microaggressions against people of color was because I see racism against people of color as very different from racism against whites. Why would that be, or how might I perceive it differently?
Because of the history of racism against people of color as opposed to people of white. Like in America, white people, we've never been, subjected, we've never been enslaved or anything like that. We've never been discriminated because of our color until affirmative action. So there's no, historical ties to anything really bad with it.
Okay, so it sounds like you're saying that the history is so heinous, so large, so broad, and all-encompassing against people of color that it has more of a meaning, more of an impact, a negative impact?
Yeah, I would think. That's what I've heard from people, and that's, a conclusion I've come to.
Okay. Other responses?
I just wanted to clarify. I went to the talk last night. I don't know if anyone else did with Dr. Goff, and he explained that affirmative action is really not racism against whites because even though without affirmative action 1% of white people would be able to go to a better school, so you could go to Harvard instead of Brown or something. But if affirmative action wasn't in place, then 28% of people of color wouldn't be able to get college degrees at all. So
Excellent memory.
it's
That was
just
perfect.
not-
Yes,
yeah,
that
was a perfect memory.
I was just so I know a lot of people sort of view affirmative action is that reverse racism, but it's white people have had the advantage for so long. It's just not at all even compares able to be compared.
And that wasn't by any means kind of just an off-the-cuff comment. That is a statement that was backed with lots of research from lots of places. He's a Harvard and Stanford educated professor at UCLA, so it's not just Joe Schmo on the street being hey, affirmative action, not racist. So this is very much founded in research that it is absolutely accurate that 1% of white students would still go to college, but they would just go to a little bit of a better school. So Brown and Harvard were the examples, but that without affirmative action, 28% of people of color would not get those degrees.
Comment about the scholarship that you could receive over your roommate. I was just thinking in my head, but there are so many scholarships, or even when you say scholarship, you look at opportunities maybe that were available to your roommate because he was white. Do you know what I mean? So
Yeah, so that idea that there's sort of an unspoken tacit affirmative action for whites, which really benefits whites in so many ways, such as legacy admissions into university. My father went to Michigan State.
You look at that as
so that's an affirmative action for me. I'm more likely to be considered to get into Michigan State, even though my GPA wasn't necessarily stellar. And so that's sort of white affirmative action for me, in a way.
That was exactly the example that was given last night. That was a counter.
Oh,
okay. So that's absolutely right. It's kind of the different types of formalized, absolutely. I mean, legacy, 25% of Villanovans are legacy, meaning that someone in their families went to Villanova before them. So that's it's not an automatic in, but it is certainly a protocol and procedure that is looked at when applying. So absolutely, good example. And we know that it's 2:00, so we're going to keep going for a few more minutes to continue the conversation. But if you do need to go, we understand. So I know a few of you are kind of
so you have
class. Yeah.
What other statements? I want to make sure that we get all of your curiosities out. There was one I don't think anyone put, there's one I don't think anyone put in the not racist category, but we had in the not racist category. We have a statement, I wonder if Joe got ignored by the teacher so much since he's black. I noticed he was the only one. Where'd you guys put that one?
really wondering, if that person was really wondering, I would go with not racist. But if they just assumed it was because he was black, then I think it's a race issue in there.
But you're still not sure if it's racist? Okay, well,
I think maybe if you guys said it, you thought of it as not racist, it might have been some confusion, at least with our group. We weren't sure with how it was worded. You were talking about the teacher, because what the teacher did, if the teacher was ignoring him because he was black, we saw that as racist. We weren't sure about just pointing it out and like wondering about it. We didn't really see, so we weren't sure which part of that statement you should have been focused on.
okay, so it was the wording that got you a little bit.
We thought it was racist, I don't remember which category, because the person who's wondering, they automatically jump to because he is black. Because I mean, if he had just said, if they said, I noticed the teacher was ignoring Joe today. I mean, for all you know, maybe the teacher was ignoring Joe because Joe was like misbehaving in like another class that he had. And he was like tired of having to deal with that and just leaving the kid alone. But I think it is racist because that's the person's first thought.
Was that it's
because it's black.
Because it's racism? Okay.
Isn't that sort of the same thing as the doctor too, though? Because he's asking so the patient could think like, oh, did he ask me that because I am? You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, probably. Does that make it racist? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it is similar to the doctor one though, you're right. It's related.
And that's to mention that it's like over time, so maybe that wasn't this person's first thought. Maybe they like kept seeing it over time and knew that he wasn't like misbehaving in a while.
That's true, we don't really know, but
he always gets ignored. So maybe people have been observing this for a year and like you can't see any other reason. You think, well, maybe it is because he's black.
Okay, and in that case, you're saying that it wouldn't be racist. It's like, well, I've seen a trend here that Joe's continually being ignored by the teacher, and he's not doing anything wrong. So I'm wondering what this is about. Maybe it is a race thing. And so there's that question again: is it okay to notice race? Is it a bad thing to notice race, which a lot of us have been taught? And I'm hearing yes, it's okay to notice and question. Maybe it is a race issue. Maybe it's not. Some of you are saying, well, yeah, maybe it's not. That we have to look at the whole other options. But yeah, it's okay sometimes to really question: is this about race? Because historically, we know. Right now, we know that. Some kids of color do get overlooked and ignored in the classroom. I've done a study with Mexican kids down in Kennett Square, and they tell me that on a regular basis. I'm ignored all the time by my white teachers. And so because it's something that happens to people of color all the time, that might be a thought that comes up. And if you're aware of that, that's a thought that comes up about he's being ignored a lot. Wonder if this is related to race.
Could it in a way be seen as a micro-invalidation maybe against the professor? Because it would automatically presume that the professor's behavior is racially charged, and maybe the professor has legitimate reasons for not calling on Joe in class. Couldn't it be seen as excluding or negating or nullifying the thoughts or feelings of the professor? Maybe he just isn't contributing anything worthwhile to the class, and he doesn't see it as beneficial to have Joe participate. Does it automatically have to be a racially charged behavior on the professor's part? And because the professor may not be a person of color, does that automatically exclude them from a person who can be micro-invalidated?
How would you respond to that one?
I think it's a really good question. And I think if I'm remembering the question correctly, we made quite an assumption, didn't we? I don't know, the teacher's not a person of color. So if we were making the assumption that the teacher's white, so even in that assumption, why couldn't it be a black professor or a black teacher ignoring Joe? Could it be a Latino? Why couldn't it be an Asian? So it's important that we first recognize our first assumption. And second, that's a tricky one.
Also, the phrasing was sort of weird because when it said, I noticed that he was the only one, I didn't know whether or not to interpret it as he was the only black person in class or if he was the only one being ignored. Because, I don't know.
But would it be different than if he was the only black person in the room? You're saying that it might be more likely to think it might be race?
I feel if he was the only black person in the room, it would be more legitimate to jump to that conclusion, but again, the phrasing was sort of ambiguous.
Yeah. And I think there always can be that question, we can't really get into someone's head and kind of know the underlying reason why they're doing something. Could it be race? Yes. Is that teacher aware that it might be race, even if it is race? Again, we're sometimes very unconscious of our actions. So the idea is that some of these things that we say and do, we do them without even being aware of them. ignoring students of color in the classroom, or me only talking to my male students all the time and I ignore my female students. If someone said, hey, you know, you're being sexist, I wouldn't be aware of it probably. But so there's that idea that once we become aware of these things that we're saying or doing, then it becomes a conscientious thing, and hopefully we stop doing those things. I'll say one more statement and then I'll stop with this. And the idea of being unconscious about some of our racism, very subtle forms of racism, that it can really have bad outcomes when we work with people because we may do things like ignore certain students. Doctors have been shown to actually choose harmful treatment tactics with their patients based on their racist assumptions and stereotypes about certain groups. And so again, it's being unaware. And so there was a particular study where they took doctors who said, I know I have racist assumptions, I know I do, perceptions, beliefs about certain groups, and then they had a set of doctors that are like, no way, not at all, none, I'm not racist. And then they took a look at treatment decisions that they made for patients of color. These were white doctors. And what they found is that the doctors who said, I have racist assumptions, I'm aware of them, they made less biased and less harmful treatment decisions for the patients of color. And the ones that said, I'm not racist, no, there's nothing in my conscience that I can even find that's racist, they made some harmful, less appropriate decisions for the patients of color. So really it's just that idea about how can we bring in a level of awareness about what you guys might unconsciously be doing that might someday play into when you're working as a doctor or if you're a teacher, etc.
And it's important to recognize, I know we only have a few minutes, that these microaggressions do affect people. And one of the studies that kind of got us together and started talking, I looked at Villanova students specifically. So, you know Villanova students, you are Villanova students. And when I sent a survey out a few years ago, before you were all here, and it's a survey sent to all students of color who identified as students of color on their application to the university. And I sent a list of surveys that said, okay, tell me which of these experiences happens to you. How often does it happen to you? And the experiences were, I'm watched in the bookstore. I am commonly asked about cleaning or cooking. It is assumed that I work for dining services or maintenance, and kind of these assumptions, and there was a whole list. Students completed the survey. And there's an interesting correlation, and the correlation was the more that students saw themselves closely connected with their cultural and my encounters as being racially motivated, and the more they affected me. So for example, if I heard something about I'm only here because of affirmative action at Villanova, if I heard a statement like that, and if I continue to hear a statement like that, and I'm very closely tied to my culture, it would certainly affect me more. It would affect my academics, my social health, my mental health, and these are all things that kind of, again, add up over time. The more that you hear them, the more that you believe them. The more that you believe them, the more it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So it's very important that we recognize that our words do impact. The way that we say things, whether we mean them or not, it is how, again, people hear them. And you might not be the first person that said that. You might not be the second person or the third person, but the 10th or the dozenth. And so it's important that we recognize that every statement that we make can be harmful, and just to be aware of our words, aware of our actions, and that's the point of this. I think we've got another person coming in right after us. So
I'll add that microaggressions are particularly harmful because people of color have told me, and they've said in studies, it's not that I hear it once, it's not that I hear it twice, it's not that I hear it 3 times. I hear this almost every day of my life. Gee, you're so articulate. How can you be so smart? Oh, gee, where did you learn your English when you're like 4th generation? And so it's really the constant hearing these comments over and over and over. You're like, you know what? I really think this is about race. I can assume maybe it's not, but after hearing this the 450th time this year, I'm thinking there might be something there. And so really when someone reacts to you, they might not be reacting to just your one statement, it's to hearing hundreds of that statement and the frustration with that. You were going to add something?
I mean, is the session over? I don't know, it just reminded me of an experience I had earlier in the week at Urban Bridges Literacy Service Site. The person I was tutoring was speaking about how, like, she's is a very articulate woman, and she is constantly like posed like that question, like, oh, how did you learn how to speak so white? And she always is offended by that because she is a person of color, she is African American, and like she says that she doesn't speak white, she speaks proper English, and how that in a way is sort of like
associated with whiteness.
her,
Yeah.
Like Obama and Harry Reid.
Yeah, all those statements about them, yeah.
Okay, so what would that be? Would that be a micro-invalidation?
What, saying that you're so articulate?
No, what
That-
Harry Reid said about Obama.
That Obama, light-skinned, without any
Negro dialect.
Negro dialect. That's
Yeah.
right.
Unless
So
he intended.
unless he intended.
Unless he
that's
intended it,
right.
then it was just a part, which he probably did, right? So that was probably a micro assault in that case, but yeah, probably an insult.
Yeah, one more. Yes.
Okay, I have a question, like, is it okay to ask people about their culture? Like, I have, like, being here at Villanova, there's lots of people from all over, and it's really interesting for me to, like, ask them questions about their culture. But is that considered, like, a microaggression? If I'm like, so what's it like in, like, if I know where they live, is it bad if I ask, like, so what's the culture like there?
Got someone over here saying no.
Ask, please. Please ask. It's more as if, and when you ask, and the person gets like mad or something, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You just wanted to know. It's the person who, like she was saying, you hear something a million times, and you got all this aggression build up from it, and then they just try to explode it on you. And it's really nothing you had to do with it. It was just you asked the question, that triggered that for them, and then they just go ahead and explode. But please ask the question, because what we need is that awareness to bring the bring it to conscious, so we're aware of it. So when we go through things, we can want to educate people about our culture and things like that. So please ask the questions.
Yeah, I don't want you guys to leave this room and say, oh, we learned today we're never supposed to talk about race. No, I'm actually encouraging you to talk about race, to talk about these things. But if you can understand a little bit about history and the history of racism in the country, and you study it and read more about it, you'll understand why these particular comments that we pulled out for you, these are insulting, but that doesn't mean that talking about race and racism is insulting. They're two totally different things. But because of historical racism and whiteness, these are whiteness insulting statements. But that's not talking about race.
Good question. I'm glad you asked
that is a really good question.
And then you two, and then I think we have to call it.
Yeah, sorry, I was just gonna say really quickly, I saw a talk earlier this year through like the Africana Studies program that was this like historian about swimming pools and racism, which is actually a really like long story that doesn't matter right now. But his whole point was that like, even though he's like a historian basically is the point, so he's like studied the history of like racism and whatever else, and like even though people do not identify as much as like racist today, like you might not like actually have like open like racist like tendencies, it's like because of the racist tendencies of the past, like we're still living out the consequences of that. So like because of the divisions like between people, or because you can live in a suburb that's literally all white, or an area that's like mostly Latino, or like whatever, you know what I mean? If because people don't grow up in places that are really, really diverse, like all the time, that's why like I feel like this is where some of these assumptions come from, where you might say like, you know, I never hang around black people at all, and so like I think that you talk more articulately, like why is that? You know what I mean? Because you're just so, like people just don't know because they don't interact with each other. They're very like uninformed and like exposed to each other. And I feel like that's where like those exotic comments come from too, because it's like if you're only isolated with people with your own race, it's like when you interact with other people, you make these microaggressions like unknowingly. So I just thought that was kind of like, it might not be actually that you're like racist, it's just that you say racist things because you don't interact enough with other races.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of adapt whatever we hear around us, right? We're part of our culture. And if that's all you hear all the time, which, you know, me growing up, that's all I heard all the time. I grew up in a whiteness culture, which is an inherently racist culture. So I would say, yes, I'm a racist because I adapted a racist culture. And it comes out of my mouth sometimes, and I work on it all the time so that I don't keep doing it. And I think you're right. Being around other people is one great way to really learn and kind of figure out what works, what doesn't, and what's appropriate, what's not.
My question was, it's actually kind of different from the other questions that we've been asking, but why is it that like whenever like with Barack Obama, he's half black, and when he like became president, people were like, oh, he's such a credit to his race. Why do people think that's okay? Because how come like he can't be president? He can't just be like, oh, you know, that's really great for him that he, you know, worked so hard and now he's president. How come it has to be, oh, you're a credit to your race? But like if we had a white president, it's like, oh, okay, we have a white president. He's not a credit to his race. Like, why is it whenever anyone of color does something, it's like, you're a credit to your race? And like, why do people think that's okay to say that?
I don't know why they think it's okay, but it happens all the time. And if we think about it in terms of
You say it too.
what?
And then the people of color say it too.
Absolutely, but if you think about it, in terms of, and one example that I heard the other day that I thought was really good, Timothy McVeigh. Do you know who Timothy McVeigh is? Blew up in Oklahoma, did the bombing, the big bombing back in the 90s. And McVeigh, so he's Irish. Do we talk about him as an Irish bomber who bombed Oklahoma? No. But yet in terms of if there is an airplane involved and there's a bombing, clearly it's about Muslim folks all together as a collective. So it's how we associate one person with, oh, he was an individual who was crazy, or these people are individuals. So it's how we frame, how we use our words and how we're framing things because of our experiences, because of our culture, because of how we've been socialized. And absolutely, and I think you're right. Does everyone do it sometimes? Yeah. And it's breaking those habits that we have to work on. And I think Kristen made an excellent point. It's, have we all heard these things? Yes. Do we all know what's offensive? We have an idea. But it's how you are speaking about things and how you're speaking with people and to people and making those meaningful relationships that make you break those stereotypes, that make you break and question the things that you've heard and you've learned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.